So, good evening and welcome to the 8th edition of the CENIEH Distinguished Annual Lecture. You know, this is our most cherished and beloved event, scientific, social, public event at CENIEH. And for us, as usual, it's always a celebration of science, of knowledge, of human evolution, of collegiality, of friendship. It's always a pleasure to have this event, and also, the pleasure of learning from those who can significantly contribute to our understanding of human evolution. So it is a great honor to introduce today's speaker. He's Professor David Wengrow. He's Professor of Comparative Archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. And I would say that one of the most influential voices in contemporary archaeology and anthropology. Those of us who study the past feel compelled to really study and reconstruct what happened working with the scattered evidence. We need fragments, traces, remains, images, objects, molecules. And from those pieces, we always try to understand what happened. But what emerges is never just a neutral collection of facts. It's also a narrative, a way of connecting those dots. This is one of the reasons why I think that Professor Wengrow's work is so powerful. He reminds us that the stories we tell about the human past are not innocent. They shape how we understand human nature, freedom, inequality, social change, and even the futures we are able to imagine. Together with the late David Grover, he is the author of The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, a book that has an extraordinary international impact and has challenged many inherited assumptions about the origins of human societies. Today, Professor Wengrow will deliver a lecture entitled The Role of the Image Systems in Human Evolution and History, invited us to think of images not simply as illustrations of thought, but as powerful ways of organizing knowledge, experience, and imagination. David, thank you so much for being with us today, and it's a real pleasure, and we hope you also enjoy being with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a real privilege to be here in Burgos and to see the kind of really world-leading work that's going on in this center under the mentorship of Maria Martín-Torres. I think most of you probably know I'm not a specialist in the study of human origins or early human prehistory, but I do want to take the opportunity to talk about an issue of general anthropological significance, which is the role of what I'll be calling image systems in human evolution and history. And I think it's possibly quite an urgent topic in the sense that the capacity of images to create social reality and to create political realities is arguably now overtaking other media of political interaction. So it's a deep reflection on these points, and I'd like to start with a kind of thought experiment which comes from the famous second discourse, the 1754 discourse on the origins of inequality by the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in that piece of writing, he asks his reader to imagine a human being with the capacity to mark its own body, adorning its skin with feathers, shells, or pigments, but lacking the capacity for making images. This is a fictional being that Rousseau is asking us to imagine in its state of nature, as he calls it. It's a being which possesses an imagination, but its mind, he says, paints no pictures. Just like it has a heart, but it doesn't have a conscience. And being unable to conjure images in the mind, Rousseau's primordial human is also lacking in foresight. It's trapped in a kind of eternal present, incapable of conceiving any reality other than that which is in front of it in that moment. And this is a rhetorical ploy which Rousseau is using, a necessary step to deprive his so-called savage of the image-making faculty. He also deprives it of conventional language. He deprives it of property relations. He deprives it of abstract thought. And this is how he can then go on to tell the famous story about how these human-like creatures run, as he puts it, headlong for their chains, believing that they were securing their liberty. For, he says, although they had enough reason to see the advantages of political institutions, they did not have enough experience to foresee the dangers. Now, I think implied in the logic of this is a notion, an intimation, that thought, image, and the making of social worlds are profoundly connected. And today, increasingly, this is an idea that is borne out by the findings of neuroscience, as discussed, for example, by Thomas Metzinger in his 2009 book, The Ego Tunnel. And it's something that is very richly exemplified in ethnographic studies, most rigorously perhaps for North America and Oceania, and also in the first-hand testimonies of indigenous experts and artists, which is something that I'll come back to in due course. So expressing himself rhetorically by imagining what it might mean to be without it, Rousseau notes how the faculty of image-making begins neither in pure thought nor in the external world of art and ornament, but rather in the sympathetic meeting of human minds with specific materials in their vicinity, in its vicinity. And moreover, that the capacity to make images is connected to what we would now see as an evolved capacity for mental time travel, or what the experimental psychologist Endel Tulving called chronesthesia. That is, the ability to project oneself consciously into the past or into the future, which also means that image making is closely tied to the arts of memory, modeling, and navigation. Pacific artworks illustrate these features of image systems, I think, with special clarity, because they make explicit reference to previous and future creations. Shell valuables used in kula ceremonies carry in their forms an archive of their own passage from one owner to the next, while ceremonial axes that circulate at mortuary feasts in adjacent parts of Melanesia turn out to be complex technical models, calling to mind past relations and foreshadowing ones to come. Or we might consider the figural carvings of New Ireland, which are known as Malangan. These are designed to open pathways of memory which lead via images to particular ancestral names, which are not ordinarily spoken. As Marilyn Strathern puts it, people do not therefore have to explain such images by reference to events outside them. The images contain events. As opposed to isolated acts of making marks or patterns or figures, image systems of this kind are cognitive supports and technical supports for large-scale social networks, for populations bound together in such networks. Images work to synchronize mental processes, bringing complex imaginaries of time, space, and states of being into alignment. Image systems of this kind form part of our species' cultural heritage, and their history surely extends back much further than their earliest durable traces in the archaeological record of the Paleolithic. Epic songs, poetry, and other skilled forms of discourse are often anchored to images and forms of memory work that they entail. Images are vital aids in navigating cosmological space through divination, vision quests, and shamanic journeys, just as they are essential in navigating physical space. Arguably, it is only image systems that can mediate between these different orders of experience. And I think it can hardly be doubted that image systems played a crucial role in Homo sapiens' development of those skills which led to the first great conquests of maritime space. Most likely, the images in question were made of ephemeral materials, like these stick charts, used until quite recent times by inhabitants of the remote Marshall Islands. These are made of palm ribs, coconut fibers, and shells, and these are charts which are not maps. They're not maps, but they work as analogical models, helping Marshallese navigators commit to memory the principles of ocean swell and land interaction that they would encounter on these long sea voyages. Now, of course, no devices like this could possibly be expected to survive from the period between, say, 70,000 and 10,000 years ago, when our species first occupied large parts of Oceania, and frankly, even if they did, I don't think even the most brilliant archaeologist would have a great deal of success figuring out what they were used for just by looking at them, because they already assume a lot of practical knowledge grounded in the experience of maritime travel along those island chains. So image systems, as I hope is already becoming obvious, are in no way confined to small-scale societies. Actually, it's quite the opposite. More often, they've served to integrate diverse populations at a regional or even continental scale, forming open networks whose participants may otherwise be widely dispersed and often speak different or sometimes even unrelated languages. These aspects of their distribution highlight two important features of image systems, one negative, the other positive. Firstly, that they don't necessarily require explicit linguistic exegesis or explanation to perform their functions. And secondly, that they are highly effective vehicles of cartographic and topological reasoning, which become particularly important when social interaction takes on a discontinuous or sporadic form, switching between different scales, as when moving across the patchwork ecologies that span vast areas of Australasia and Oceania, regions which are famous for their complex image systems. Archaeological studies suggest that scalar alternations are an extremely ancient feature of human social behavior, arising, for example, from the seasonal rounds and seasonal variations of Paleolithic hunters, fishers, and gatherers. It is likely that variations in the size and form of groups entailed changes in moral norms and political arrangements across different parts of the annual cycle. The precise nature of these changes will itself have been highly variable, and I don't think it can be predicted by things like demography or environment alone. Regular alternations of this sort may well be among the ecological factors shaping human cognition in deep evolutionary time. Now, of course, very few images survive from such early periods, although there are, of course, some. But the standing architectural remains of later foraging or horticultural societies offer some striking examples of this convergence between periodic assemblies and the coordination of labor to produce durable images, usually at sensitive points of orientation in the landscape and sometimes on a really spectacular scale. Notable examples, which can illustrate something of the possible variety in materials and design, include the Urfa Valley culture of southern Turkey, to which the famous sites of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe belong, or, for example, the late woodland effigy mound culture of the American Midwest, with its focus on figural and geometric earthworks. On the other hand, it is abundantly clear that image systems are not primitive or archaic features of human culture. History and archaeology offer many cases of expansive civilizations which never coalesced into formal empires and whose unity is most consistently expressed not in traces of administrative power or military power, but rather in the use of images to activate links between local groups and superordinate networks. Image-based polities of this kind have spanned enormous territories. They are ubiquitous, not just in Oceania, but also in the pre-Columbian Americas, which furnish such notable examples as Chavin de Huantar, Ohio Hopewell, Cahokia, or Olmec, Mexico. To the initial astonishment of their European discoverers, it turned out that regional systems of this kind could mobilize labor to produce monuments of precise dimensions and spatial orientation, stone carvings, ceremonial ball courts, figurative earthworks, on a scale more typically associated with the literate states and empires of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, or China. I think it would be a mistake to deduce from this any simple contrast between the Americas and Eurasia. The early history of the Mediterranean and the Central Asian steppe also presents many cases of image systems as connectors between otherwise fragmented social groups, where the transmission of certain images and certain ways of producing images prefigures important transformations of political life and religious life. Well-known examples include the so-called orientalizing artworks of the Iron Age Mediterranean and the roughly contemporaneous animal style art of Central Asia, which reached from the Black Sea all the way to the frontiers of China. Close inspection of the figures and images in question shows that they include stable sets of anatomical composites, monsters, if you like, which reveal certain shared constraints on their composition and a tendency to use prototypes which originate in the first cities. Such intercultural styles of complex pictographs flourished in parallel with the earliest forms of writing. Now, trying to fit cases like Chavin or Cahokia into a framework of social evolution based on the history of Eurasia has proved very difficult. And I don't think this is because of any distinction between oral and literate culture, but rather because those Eurasian frameworks assume from the beginning that power over other people resides in the ownership of land, of landed estates and other tangible resources, and in the capacity to administer them and defend them. It's intriguing to note recent comparisons between the Americas and Eurasia, which suggest that disparities in material wealth, measured by archaeological proxies like different house sizes, were actually of secondary importance in many pre-Columbian societies, forming a contrast with Bronze Age Eurasia, where they consistently reach much higher levels. And differences of this kind have been taken to indicate that overall levels of social inequality were greater in ancient Eurasia than in the Americas. Now, I actually suspect this is a misreading of the evidence, because a wealth of ethno-historical data points towards a different interpretation, which puts images and image systems, as opposed to material surplus, at the center of Amerindian political economies. Actually, what these quantitative studies might reflect, I suspect, is simply that power and centralization in the Americas was not usually grounded in the stockpiling of goods for defense or landed estates, but rather in control over what the anthropologist Robert Lowy termed sacra, indigenous forms of property that were immaterial or incorporeal, including anything from magic formula to stories or medical knowledge, or the right to perform a certain dance, or stitch a certain pattern onto one's clothing, or create a certain kind of image. And I think it can hardly be a coincidence that in more recent First Nation societies, it was usually ownership of such incorporeal, intangible goods, which Lowy actually compares to our copyrights and the idea of patents, that unlock rights to usufruct over land and resources. So weapons, tools, and hunting grounds might be freely shared, but the esoteric powers to reproduce game or ensure luck in the chase were individually owned and jealously guarded. They were also inherited, bought, and sold. Quite often, sakra have both material and immaterial elements, as with these ceremonial bundles used by plain societies, which include not only physical objects, but also dances, rituals, and songs. Famously, among groups on the Pacific Northwest coast, such rites were fiercely competed for through claims to honorific titles captured in images emblazoned on their heirloom treasures. Kwakiutl society, to take just one example, ownership of an heirloom wooden feast dish like this also conveyed the right to gather berries on a stretch of land with which to then fill it, which in turn afforded the owner the right to present those berries while performing a certain kind of song at a certain feast, and so on. Feast dishes like this are both physical and incorporeal property at the same time, because they can die and be reincarnated. While the dish itself may rot away or be burnt, the names of the protective spirits carved onto its surface, and also the ladles that were used with these dishes, are considered to be eternal, and the images are a means of calling them to mind and contesting claims upon them. Rousseau's discourse also reminds us of the political potential in image systems. Making visible the workings of a configuration of social reality also means laying that reality open to scrutiny, reflection, and critique. Modern theorists of social evolution, placing their eggs in the flimsiest part of Rousseau's basket, have largely ignored this point, while embracing the fable of humanity's original innocence and unwitting departure from a state of pristine simplicity on a voyage of technological discovery that would ultimately guarantee both our complexity and our enslavement. But in fact, what the archaeological record now shows is quite the opposite. Far from lacking imagination or lacking self-consciousness, Paleolithic communities created images of social forms, or what Rousseau might have called instituted signs, that could not possibly have formed the permanent basis of their collective existence, let alone their everyday modes of political or economic organization. Most striking, perhaps, in this respect, are the so-called aristocratic burials of the European Upper Paleolithic. Ritual dioramas, where the decorated corpses of exceptional individuals, often singled out by very unusual physical features which can be traced in their skeletal remains, were transformed into images of power, saturated with ornaments and exotic regalia. Now, superficially, the burials in question bear comparison with chiefly or even royal tombs of much later periods, but they lack any obvious counterpart outside the domain of ritual performances, where barely any trace of social rank or stratification can be found in the archaeological record. Ritual tableaus created by Ice Age hunter-gatherers call to mind the possibility of a ranked society, of exactly the sort that seems to have been avoided in their daily affairs. And this reminds me of Claude Lévi-Strauss' observation in Triste Tropique, that the graphic art of Kadeveu women is, as he puts it, like the phantasm of a society ardently and insatiably seeking a means of expressing symbolically the institutions it might have, if its interests did not stand in the way. Now, I think these kinds of discoveries support the view, which was advanced by David Graeber and myself in our collaborative work, that early human societies in general were characterized by a much higher degree of conscious social experimentation than is generally thought, and image systems were integral, I suggest, to this kind of projective social thought. Also quite striking is the sheer geographical scale on which such systems operated among forager groups that were demographically sparse and often widely dispersed. And these findings also resonate with a change that's taking place in evolutionary anthropology, which I think is now finally coming to terms with what anthropologists have been saying all along, ethnographers that is, which is that recent and contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, even living under conditions of displacement and demographic decline, are not usually confined to isolated bands, which is one of the more unfortunate legacies of Rousseau, but actually keep open the possibility of social connections with thousands of other people who are regarded as potential kin, sharing rights, debts, and other obligations, despite the fact that they are geographically spread out, have little common genetic inheritance, biology is not the point here, and often speak different first languages. And not by chance, I think some of those same evolutionary studies are now also rediscovering the importance of art and image systems like the acrylic paintings produced by Aboriginal groups in Australia's Western Desert. And I think here we can actually go a step further and turn to the indigenous concept of Wunan, which is native to the Kimberley region of northwestern Australia, from which I've actually recently come back. Wunan describes the workings of image systems, I think, a lot more elegantly than any Western neologism. In the older ethnographic literature, Wunan refers simultaneously to at least two completely different things. One is a system of making images, in this case, rock paintings, which range in scale from miniature to absolutely massive. I can't show you any because it's against the law. And it also refers to these far-flung what we might call hospitality zones, which are crossed by people from hundreds of different Aboriginal communities, and within them, gifts and also technological ideas and innovations are exchanged, and givers and receivers can always expect to receive a welcome and care. Now, at the same time, Wunan refers to the overall structure of the moiety system, which extends between groups and ensures that everyone has partners or potential hosts, even in distant places. In Ngarenyin, intellectuals have recently made a point of explaining that Wunan means even more than this. The Wunan system, they emphasize, is first and foremost a system of law, but it's a law that is impressed on the landscape through complex images, and you can only learn it by moving through the land. It is also, and I quote, a set of prescriptive and proscriptive rules of civilized behavior, the most prized possession of a Ngarenyin adult. Being civilized in this way has both a moral and aesthetic dimension. One senior lawman, the late David Maljali, argued explicitly that while relations to land in the dominant settler culture are founded primarily on economics, Aboriginal civilization is built on a combination of aesthetic, topographic, and moral principles. Wunan, he says, is evidence of a social order started by an artist. And I'll quote again from Maljali. That is, the law is depicted through the aesthetic nature of the land. To indigenous Australians, symbolism holds as much legal validity as mathematics does for the laws of physics. Perhaps, he says, this is why these laws have more in common with each other than with the Western legal codes. Maljali states that the law was called the Wunan system, the law of sharing. That is, a jurisprudence of relationship and witnessing each other's behavior. Now, in drawing this talk to a close, I want to reflect briefly on how the rising epistemological status of image systems within the social and the cognitive sciences challenges some important assumptions about the emergence of literacy and the intellectual consequences of becoming literate. It's only half a century ago, in his influential book, A Study of Writing, that I.J. Gelb could still identify aesthetic impulses as an obstacle to humanity's intellectual development, an obstacle to the discovery of things like writing and mathematics. Gelb viewed the discovery that signs can work in conventional ways to convey language and calculus, as opposed to their value as depictions or pictorial representations, as a kind of major intellectual breakthrough in human systems of reasoning, which led to all the modern scientific discoveries. Now, this always begged a very obvious question, which was most famously posed by Lévi-Strauss, which is this: what other kinds of intellectual activity did then make possible discoveries like systems of maritime navigation, monumental architecture, the invention of farming, the invention of complex metallurgy, and so on, all of which predate writing and predate formal mathematics by thousands of years? And the answer, as we can perhaps now begin to see, lies to a significant degree with image systems. Modern research has also shown Gelb's evolutionary scheme to rest on a false equation between script and the notation of language, which experts in early writing systems now actually consider to be a relatively minor component for the inventors of the world's first writing systems, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Chinese logograms, or the glyph-based systems of Egypt and the Maya actually don't encode speech very much. And despite being known for decades now, these findings haven't really filtered out very far beyond these disciplinary specialisms. So cognitive and evolutionary studies of literacy, like Stanislav Dehaene's book, which is otherwise quite brilliant, called Reading in the Brain, have yet really to absorb their implications. Anthropologists, too, often seem to be working with an outdated understanding of script development as being determined by the notation of spoken language. Art historians, on the other hand, may be working with an equally outdated understanding of image systems as being underdetermined by complex and rigorous thought processes. What about archaeologists? Well, I think we're sort of in the position of these happy magpies, sort of hopping around, taking scraps of insight from all the other disciplines. But with some exceptions, I think archaeologists have actually been quite reluctant to give images even the most basic attentions of our own disciplinary toolkit: the detailed study of distribution, principles of assemblage, morphology, taphonomy, and depositional context. And one exception is the field of prehistoric rock art studies. At Lubang Jereji Saleh on the island of Borneo, image systems executed on cave walls can now be traced back some 40,000 years, while in South Sulawesi, new dating methods are pushing these findings back into chronological periods which are considerably older than the rock art of the Upper Paleolithic in Iberia and other parts of Western Europe. Etchings that survive on stone and ochre from Blombos Cave in South Africa take the surviving record of human image making back to around 80,000 BC. Now, of course, this is still a very late point in evolutionary time relative to the appearance of cognitively modern Homo sapiens, which probably lie well over 100,000 or maybe even 200,000 years further into the past. But contrary to what is sometimes suggested, I don't think there is any great mystery here. Quite aside from the lost record of what was thought and what was done in perishable media, once we accept what is known ethnographically and what indigenous experts are telling us, which is that image systems are not less complex technical or philosophical achievements than writing systems, that they can express sophisticated dialogical theories of social experience and time, and that their creation is often linked to breakthroughs in other fields of knowledge, the mystery vanishes. To claim otherwise is to insist on the fallacy that image systems should have somehow emerged spontaneously at the dawn of human history, along with language, advanced motor skills, or the very capacity for abstract thought. And really, this just seems to be another way of trivializing the intellectual achievements of people without writing, while also consigning those achievements to a completely artificial temporality. So to conclude my lecture, and having just returned from a field trip to the Kimberley, I would like to emphasize that these are more than just theoretical or academic questions. Denying the validity or the viability of image systems as archives of knowledge and as systems of law is the intellectual counterpart to an ongoing process of physical erasure, actively pursued by multinational mining companies in collusion with states, removing traces of their existence from the surface of the earth or reducing them to isolated monuments or artworks. From the Canadian Northwest Coast to Amazonia and Northern Australia, recording and reconstituting relationships between images, historically known legal systems, and the land is integral to struggles for indigenous sovereignty. By recovering past capacities for future thinking, such struggles contest present realities and bring alternatives into view. In doing so, I think they also expose the mythical foundations of a prehistory that populates the early human past with imaginary subjects, like Rousseau did, artificially robbed of the very capacity for mental time travel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, David, for such a beautiful and stimulating, provoking talk. That I think that make us think differently about culture, art, and communication. And of course, if you have any question, I think it's a great opportunity to talk to him.
Hey, thank you. That was really provocative, and I really appreciate the message that you're sending with this as well. And I learned a lot. So your talk made me think of two things that I'd love your thoughts about. One is, how do you think this relates, or could you talk a little bit too about the megalithic symbolism as well? And then also, do you think we ever might be able to translate, like we do with languages and written languages, do you think we might ever be able to translate some of the meanings out of these older images the way we do with language?
Thank you, yeah. I was actually sharing a story with some of your colleagues earlier today, which I heard in Australia. It was actually something that was done at the famous caves of Lascaux, where they invited 4 Ngaranian elders to visit the site with an anthropologist, and comment on the famous paintings of bison and horses and all the rest of it. And this was written up by an anthropologist called Tony Redmond, but unfortunately is not published. But he let me read it, and it's very interesting in terms of the expectations of the French archaeologists, the prehistorians, versus the perceptions and expectations of the Aboriginal artists who have been practicing their own systems of rock painting in a continuous tradition which can be dated back 5,000 years. Actually, there are systems in that region that go back 40,000 years. Clearly, the French expectation was along the lines of your question. It's like, can you please tell us what these bloody things mean? Because we've been trying to figure it out for generations, since the Abbé Brailly or something. And, maybe you can tell us, as if the other people had some sort of direct insight into the Paleolithic or something. As it happens, in the part of the Kimberley that they come from, images have to be refreshed every year. You have to retouch them at the end of the rainy season, because the Kimberley is in the monsoon zone, facing the Indian Ocean. So when the rains stop, the images have to be refreshed, and this is what actually fertilizes the land. It makes species flourish. So there's a huge controversy there between Aboriginal practitioners who want to continue doing this and conservators and archaeologists who say, well, no, these things are precious antiquities and, get your hands off them. So David Maljali, who I quoted there, has actually published an article in the journal Antiquity, going into some of these debates and explaining that no, we are not the Paleolithic, nor are we Bronze Age Scandinavia. We're still here, and this is what we do. So confronted with the marvelous images at Lascaux, what the story I was told is that the Ngarian folk came out, and the press were waiting for them to extract, their first reaction. And they said, well, what do you think? And they've been lying there looking up at these bison and so on. And apparently the first thing that one of them said was, well, if you want the images to function, you're going to have to take that metal door off the cave, because it's blocking the bison, So, it really depends what we mean by meaning. And I think what we perceive as artistic meaning or symbolic meaning may not always be the right question to ask. In other words, we might be chasing illusions, phantasms. As for megaliths, I guess you mean things like Göbekli Tepe, for example, or these monumental earthworks. I mean, one of the really surprising things about earthworks in not just North America, but actually throughout the Americas, is a study by an archaeologist called John Clark, which is buried in a slightly obscure edited volume called Signs of Power. He's a specialist in Olmec archaeology, and he found something pretty surprising, which is that monumental earthworks across the American Southeast, over to the Southwest, and south into Mesoamerica and even parts of South America are actually built to a standard metrical unit. And this is I've met him. He's a very good scholar and he's almost sort of embarrassed about his own discovery. Doesn't really know what to do with it because it implies a scale of integration and standardization that we don't tend to associate with, pre-agricultural populations. And it sort of hovers in the literature. And I don't think anyone really quite knows what to say about it. But at the very least, I think it suggests that, we really do have a long way to go in actually appreciating the scale and the complexity of these systems.
Any other question?
This is not really a question, but probably talking to what we're talking the other night. It's hard to understand today, what all these things meant in the past. And I was just thinking, taking this to my area of study, thinking about the colonization of the Americas. Can you imagine the role of the Malinche trying to explain a system of images that two worlds didn't understand, and she couldn't even understand it herself, but she had to translate it. No wonder we got into this loss of translation and things ended up the way they ended up.
Right.
So, but can you imagine that
Exactly.
woman translating to the Europeans an image system that they didn't understand, and she translating to the Mesoamericans an image system that she didn't understand herself, but she managed to translate whatever she understood. No? How amazing is that?
That's exactly right. And, I guess these struggles and these controversies are still going on, actually, 500 years later. I mean, they're still going to court and presenting evidence which would not have been considered evidence a few generations ago.
Yep.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
Very cool talk, Professor Wengrow. It's very engrossing. I just want to, being an archaeologist, it's always we are conservative to take a leap and try to be skeptical of extrapolating a lot. I'll just try to give a case study, whether you followed or read. There was a paper in Nature by Miller and Wong about ostrich eggshells in African continent, talking about stylistic sociality. Now, if you think from more artistic or morphometric ways, there are n number of ways you can make ostrich eggshells. How do you distinguish a component like whether things are socially convergent? Or is it really a proxy of sociality or a transmission?
Yeah, I know the paper you're talking about. It was about 5 years ago or something. And from recollection, they were claiming really impressive distances of cultural transmission over large parts of Eastern and Southern Africa, going back about 40 or 50,000 years, I think. To me, it looked pretty convincing in the sense that they'd done the detailed studies of the production, the chaîne opératoire, the production of the beads, and could show these correspondences that could hardly be random or fortuitous. But I know from experience that often when people go back and analyze the same body of data, they come to different conclusions. But it was a very exciting study for me because, it is frustrating, actually. There was that interesting paper by Mike Petralia not that long ago. It wasn't a paper. He did a map of just the distribution of Paleolithic archaeological research in the world and where the concentrations are and where the gaps are. And there's this huge lacuna where we just still know nothing. And people build hypotheses around the find spots and draw lines on maps or, ancient DNA migration routes and this sort of thing. And so much of it just seems to be a reflection of where the money and the research capital is and nothing else, actually. So I thought that study, whatever the merits and the problematic details and whatever, is very important because it's the first one I've seen that actually pushes back that kind of large-scale regional interaction on the African continent, into periods that usually we can only reconstruct those kind of things for Europe. So I was quite excited by that study. I sense you're slightly skeptical about it.
No, it's more about, it's like a cultural system, it's like a constellation of components. For example, another parallel anecdote will be, there's a thing about obsidian trading in Walasian Islands, which I find it super amazing because it's more convincing in terms of data that people seafar based on, for example, you're asked of how you map and seafaring,
Yeah.
And like the visibility component and many other things that comes to the picture, and you talk about, you can see the outcrops, you can see the mountains, therefore you go, and therefore your understanding of the landscape grows.
Yeah.
And most of these things kind of appear not only in art, but also things like how they hunt pelagic fishes, what kind of a resource expansion occurs. It allows you to build a more, mosaic of a picture of understanding of a system.
Exactly. I think that's why this business about mental time travel or chronesthesia is kind of fascinating, because it shows you what might be, in evolutionary terms, a kind of common denominator that links these scraps of evidence that we find in the archaeological record for roughly contemporaneous behaviors that don't appear to have much to do with each other, like rock art or complex navigation, or obsidian prospection in different places, but which might actually be linked in terms of human capacities in ways that must go back to Africa, ultimately. And I have colleagues like Kerry Shipton and Clara Boulanger who are working precisely on that Wallacean spread. And actually, I think one of the most interesting things about it is what people couldn't see. They couldn't see Australia. I mean, those coasts were not intervisible when humans crossed over. And that must, I think, since you have to take enough stuff and enough people to actually found a population, that must involve the kind of projective thought which I've been talking about. And as people have pointed out, one could take that as a proxy for cognitive complexity or modernity as much as the things that we usually tend to look for. And by the way, I don't buy the idea that Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis got to those islands by accident. Both of them. I mean, it's a very attractive notion, these sort of small creatures floating on logs or something, but how could you possibly get there and found a population by accident? And, this is quite important, as I was talking to Maria earlier. I wouldn't personally see mental time travel as a uniquely human capacity. There's quite an extensive literature on whether or not other animals possess it and to what degree. Personally, I would tend to see it as a kind of emergent property of the Homo genus, because we do have indications, I think, quite clearly from Neanderthal sites, and, arguably from here, from Homo antecessor, if you buy the excavator's interpretation of the placement of that Excalibur stone, would be exactly an illustration of, some manifestation of that kind of projective thought. So it may be something which was common in varying degrees to different members of the genus Homo, which Homo sapiens developed to an extraordinary degree.
I have a question rather, not a talk. On the subject of other hominin groups, my background is mostly working in Neanderthal and Denisovan archaeological assemblages, and I find a real frustration. There are these objects, carvings, whatever, that sometimes people have interpreted as purposeful images Neanderthals are making, and there's a lot of controversy around the dates and how reliable these things are. But I find a lot of the scientific conversations are immediately stalled by this idea of how smart Neanderthals were, if they were clever enough to be able to make images. And I think your talk is really relevant to that debate, because instead of talking about these things, we end up talking about their cognition and if they were even clever enough to make them. And I found a lot of parallels in the talk you gave today. And I wonder what your thoughts were, if you had even... I know they're well outside the scope of what you're talking about today, but I wondered if you had...
Yeah, it's not something I've looked into. I mean, from my reading of the literature on Neanderthals, I can see like two divergent paths which seem to be becoming almost like parodies of each other, where at one extreme you have people writing about Neanderthals in ways that we don't even write about early sapiens, like falling in love, making poetry, and all this kind of thing. And then at the other extreme, you've got the kind of hard-nosed, no, these people were sort of moronic ape men. And I'm afraid it's just one of those things that happens from time to time in the academy. It's like what Graeber and I call schismogenesis after Gregory Bates, and people start performing the opposite of each other. And usually the truth is sort of somewhere in the middle, but it's not something I've thought closely about.
Hi, David. I just wanted to ask if you think that Upper Paleolithic, most complex stone tools, like I'm thinking on these huge clovis or the European laurel leaves, some of them, could work as image system for hunter-gatherer societies.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention stone tools at all. But yeah, definitely. I mean, the Kimberley points that you were making were certainly used in that way. Within the exchange system that I mentioned, the Wunan system, they were important aesthetically as images, for sure. And I know people have argued that about Acheulean hand axes as well. I don't see why not.
Most of the interpretations that the stone tools usually differ from the anthropological view of.
Yeah.
So, what do you think of that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Could
yeah. I mean, they're clearly aesthetic objects. I've seen your collection. They're beautiful.
How can you explain that? I mean, that's my point. How can you differ from the classical interpretations?
Well, I guess you could do various things. You could look at different media. You know, the fact that a technology that was originally done on chert or other kinds of stone was translated into luminescent glass in the Kimberley is an aesthetic transformation. And one could look at obsidian, for example, or the replication of particular forms in different media where the significant difference is a perceptual one. You know, it's the color of the stone. It's the feel of the stone, whatever it may be, for example. Not just the form.
So,
function.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I invite all of you to continue this conversation over wine or something else next door. And I really want to again thank you, David, for such a wonderful, thought-provoking talk. And I'm sure they're going to have a lot of questions.